Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, March 16th. Tonight, we begin with the rising cost of living in Canada. Statistics Canada says the annual inflation rate climbed to 5.7% in February. This is its highest level since August 1991, and its second straight month over 5%. Helping to drive the increase in February were higher gasoline prices that were up 32.3% compared with February 2021 and 6.9% from a month earlier. StatsCan says excluding gasoline prices, the headline inflation rate would have been 4.7% in February. Grocery store prices were up as well, 7.4%, for the largest yearly increase since May 2009. It says shelter costs, which includes prices for homes and rental units, rose as well at their fastest pace since August 1983. The ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine is leading NATO ministers to consider shoring up defense in bordering countries. Defense Minister Anita Anand and other NATO defense ministers met in Brussels to look at options for bolstering defenses on the alliance's eastern flank. They are expected to order NATO commanders to draw up options for stationing troops more permanently and in greater number in the east. This is unlike the rotating battle groups of about 5,000 troops that were deployed to the Baltic states and Poland in recent years. Back here at home, tax season has begun, and the Canada Revenue Agency plans to keep a people-centered approach as it gets back up to full speed on collection activities. This year's tax filing deadline is May 2nd because April 30th falls on a Saturday. The payment deadline remains April 30th for anyone owing taxes, and that is also the deadline for anyone who qualified for interest relief to pay any outstanding income tax debt from the 2020 tax year. The Revenue Minister's spokesman says the CRA will take an empathetic approach in working with people having a tough time resolving their debts. Meanwhile, the Canadian Pacific Railway is having a tough time resolving a dispute that could lead to a full-scale strike, and the Canadian grain shippers are raising concerns about it. The Western Grain Elevator Association says such a disruption could affect producers, grain elevator companies, and consumers. Earlier this month, Teamsters Canada Rail Conference said more than 96% of its voting members support striking if necessary over wages, benefits, and pensions. The union is now in the position to issue a 72-hour strike notice to CP Rail, but has not yet done so. Turning to another important Canadian industry, Fisheries and Oceans Canada will not be providing an assessment this year on the northern cod population off the east coast of Newfoundland. DFO says 2021 was plagued with interruptions in data collection stemming from turbulent weather at sea and mechanical issues with research vessels. The agency says these interruptions are normal in any year, but the issues in 2021 resulted in data gaps large enough to warrant a change in reporting. The news comes just months before the 30th anniversary of the 1992 cod fishing moratorium that devastated Newfoundland and Labrador's economy. Some good news for car manufacturing in Ontario. The Premier and Canada's Prime Minister both say manufacturing hybrid vehicles at an Ontario Honda plant will help ensure good auto jobs into the future. Justin Trudeau and Doug Ford were in Alliston, Ontario today to formally announce the $131.6 million that each government will spend. This is to support upgrades to the Honda manufacturing plant that will eventually make hybrid vehicles. Honda Canada says retooling the plant to build the 2023 CR-V and CR-V hybrid vehicles will cost $1.4 billion over 6 years. Turning to Alberta now, where the scene has been set for a possible showdown in provincial politics. Brian Jean, the co-founder of the governing United Conservative Party, will return to the Alberta legislature after last night's by-election win in Fort McMurray, Lac La Biche. It sets up some interesting weeks ahead for fellow founder turned political foe, Premier Jason Kenney. Mr. Jean says his focus now is on renewing the party by turfing Mr. Kenney at the party's leadership review on April 9th. 2 years after the pandemic hit, Canadians with long COVID are feeling frustrated, dealing with symptoms ranging from brain fog, shortness of breath, and chronic sore throats. Conservative estimates currently peg the number of Canadians with long COVID at 300,000. But some experts say the true number lies between 10 and 50% of people infected. A senior scientist at Toronto's University Health Network believes special government-funded clinics should be set up across the country to provide care and conduct research on the long-term effects of COVID-19. Stay with us. We'll be back after the break with a look at radiation concerns amid the invasion of Ukraine. We'll have an interview with Mr. Mike Hayes, a consultant on radiation protection, up next. That and, of course, more news from around the world. Stay with us. The Ukrainian state power company says the power line supplying the Chernobyl nuclear plant has been damaged by Russian forces again after it was repaired. The Ukrenergo company said in a statement Monday that its technicians had started to supply power on Sunday evening, but before the power supply was fully restored, the occupying forces damaged it again, and that it will attempt another repair soon. The power is used to feed pumps and other equipment, which keeps spent nuclear fuel at the former power plant cool to prevent radiation leaks. The Chernobyl site is also equipped with diesel generators, and Belarusian authorities said last week that they had set up an emergency power supply from the nearby border. Well, with us to discuss these radiation concerns in Ukraine is Mr. Mike Hayes, a consultant in matters related to radiation protection. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Now, the Chernobyl plant was damaged again by Russian forces, according to the Ukrainian state power company. These Russian forces continue to be in full control of the plant since the February 24th attack. And we're also hearing reports that workers in the Chernobyl plant are being held hostage. So a lot of developments at the Chernobyl plant. Sir, tell us a little bit more about this, the severity of the situation and the risks that this presents to the safety of the plant.
Well, maybe I'll just start by saying why there's a concern at all. This used fuel or spent fuel is left over from the days when the plant was operating. That's over 30 years ago, and needs to be cooled for an extended period of time because that fuel continues to contain radioactive material as it releases its radioactivity into the water that it's contained in. That does create heat. And so there is a concern that water could overheat over time and cause some excessive release of radiation. This seems to be much of a situation in flux because my latest understanding from the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, is that power again has been restored, which is important because it provides electricity to the pumps that circulate that water around the used fuel. More importantly, I think, however, the IAEA has stated, and other external agencies have corroborated this, that even without those pumps, there is sufficient cooling capacity within that water to cool a fuel such that no radioactivity would be released.
Well, taking that into consideration, we are seeing these disruptions ongoing in terms of the power supplying this plant. So if this power is responsible for cooling radioactive material and it's continuously tampered with, how would this impact the safety of the nuclear waste within the plant?
I don't believe it is a major risk. I think from everything I understand, and I've seen corroboration, from the IAEA, which is extremely important. They would have all the parameters. There is sufficient cooling. Now, it could be that there's some increased risk to workers at the plant. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I don't see a significant public risk.
All right. So considering, as you're saying, the International Atomic Energy Agency is playing down these concerns around this plant, should international leaders be concerned at all about the situation at Chernobyl?
Well, ironically, Russia is a founding member of the IAEA, like Canada, and has been a member since 1957. It's also important to note that Russia has a lot of nuclear expertise itself. My understanding, there has been communication with Russian nuclear authorities and experts. They can help. What I would really like to see is that the IAEA be allowed into the Ukraine, not only to Chernobyl, but to the other operating sites, so that they could independently verify what is going on, communicate that to the outside world, I think that would set a lot of people's mind at ease because they would be viewed as a credible, and technically competent source.
All right, sir, just about 45 seconds left here, but what else are you keeping your eyes on as the situation progresses?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty about the state of things in the country generally because of the war, and this is a concerning situation. With respect to the other operating nuclear plants, again, I am not overly concerned, but I mean, it's never a good thing when you have people operating a nuclear power plant at gunpoint. So some of the normal protections are probably not as robust as we might like them to be, but I don't see a major concern to the public. And clearly, this is not in the Russians' best interest to have a nuclear event during this horrible war that we're watching.
All right, sir, thank you again for joining us on Forum Daily.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
We'll be back. The U.S. Senate has approved a bill that would make daylight saving time permanent in the U.S. That could mean Canada may not be far behind. BC has already approved full-time daylight time, but Premier John Horgan has said BC would not do that unless nearby U.S. states did. Meanwhile, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, along with the Premier of Quebec, have said they are receptive to ditching the time change, as Yukon and most of Saskatchewan have done, but have yet to make the move. If the entire United States goes for daylight time, that would be a heavy influence on Canada to do the same. But some experts argue that shift in time could impact Canadians in certain parts of the country in a negative way. Well, joining us now to give us deeper insight into this is Dr. Michael Antle, a psychology professor at the University of Calgary. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
So take us back to how daylight saving time came to be in the first place, Dr. Antle.
So it was originally proposed, more than 100 years ago now, as a way of saving energy. So by aligning the lights in our buildings with when we were awake, so that we could just use the free energy from the sun. So that was the main reason behind it. But there's also some recreation. So William Willett, the guy who proposed it, was an avid golfer and realized he could get more holes in after work by having the extra hour in the evening.
And how does this small 1 hour shift in time impact our sleep rhythms?
So there's a couple of things there. So we all just experienced in Canada, except for Saskatchewan and Yukon, the spring forward that we did over the weekend. And a lot of people talk about that as we lose an hour of sleep, but it's actually a little bit more insidious than that, because what it is for the next probably about 3 weeks in Canada, we're all going to be waking up about an hour earlier every workday, every school day, relative to what our body clock wants us to do. So the sunrises are getting earlier every day, but it's not going to be until about mid-April that it catches up to where it was. And this is why this one time change actually makes so much of a negative impact for people over just having one bad night's sleep. Usually after you've had a bad night's sleep, you feel better after the following sleep. But with this one, it actually persists for much longer because you're forced to get up before your body is ready.
And does this have any impact on our mental health and overall well-being, doctor?
Well, going to work, driving to work when you're tired and you're stressed can actually have a negative impact. We know that there's going to be higher rates of accidents just from this time change that we just had. But if we were to go to permanent time, people are in the winter, it's going to be even harder for them to get up. You'll probably have more seasonal depressions and the seasonal affective disorder that's more acute here in Canada than in the US to be creeping in there as well. When you live on the wrong time, when they've done some studies on this, we find higher rates of disease, poor health indexes, and actually higher rates of cancer with people who experience later sunsets because they get less sleep.
That's really interesting, doctor. Now, considering Yukon and most of Saskatchewan have adopted this permanent time, are certain parts of Canada more dependent on daylight saving time than others?
Well, you're going to feel the adverse effects both in the summer and in the winter the further north you go. So the extreme, of course, are populations living up in the Arctic, when in the summer, no matter what the clock is set to, the sun never sets. And in the winter, it never rises above the equator, above the horizon, so you never see that. But it depends on, I guess, how far off the right time you are. So places like Alberta, where I'm located, are actually quite far off of the time we should be following anyways. So we'd find permanent daylight time harder to deal with. people in the maritime provinces and southern Ontario that are further south aren't going to have the extreme changes in day length that people in Edmonton would have. So yeah, the further north you have, the harder the summers with the really late sunsets, and the harder the winters with the really late sunrises will be for them.
So would a permanent time change for the country overall be better for Canada compared to individual provinces?
Well, from an economics point of view, it would make sense for trying to organize activities that everybody in the country is going to enjoy, like hockey games. I know that's a big challenge, timing the East Coast games versus the West Coast games. So you want to have a national strategy for sure, just to facilitate trade and all the interactions in such a wide country.
All right, Doctor, just about a minute left here, but what are your thoughts on this? Would you say a shift to permanent time is a good idea?
Permanent time would be great. We know there is harm that comes from the springing forward. The fall back, we catch a little bit extra sleep, so that helps us. So the time changes aren't good, but you got to pick the right time. And because we're so far north, permanent daylight time would actually be worse than the status quo of springing forward and falling back. Permanent standard time would actually be the best of all for our health and well-being.
All right, Dr. Antle, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
Stay with us. Coming up after the break, we'll be taking a look at today's top international headlines. Some progress is made in the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. The president of Ukraine addresses the U.S. Congress. Northern Japan is rocked by a 7.3 magnitude earthquake, and North Korea fails a missile launch, causing the missile to explode. These stories and more when we return, so stay with us. We'll be right back here on Forum Daily News. Talks between Ukraine and Russia continued for an unprecedented third straight day. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says the two sides are discussing a neutral military status for Ukraine. He says a business-like spirit that's starting to surface in the talks, and a statement by Ukraine's president that it realizes it cannot join NATO, quote, gives hope that we can agree on this issue. Vladimir Zelensky is now describing Russia's demands for ending the war as becoming more realistic. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian president urged members of the U.S. Congress and all Americans to remember Pearl Harbor and September 11th. Mr. Zelensky used his video address to play an emotional video of the destruction and devastation in his country, saying Ukraine needs the U.S. to do more to help it fight Russia. But U.S. President Joe Biden has insisted there will be no American troops in Ukraine and has resisted Mr. Zelensky's pleas for warplanes as too risky, saying that it could lead to World War III. But new actions against the war were recently taken in Europe. The 47-nation Council of Europe has expelled Russia from the human rights body after 26 years of membership. The unprecedented move is being taken in response to the Russian invasion and war in Ukraine. The decision follows weeks of condemnation of Russia's actions in the country. All right, I want to turn to a powerful 7.3 magnitude earthquake that shook northern Japan. There are no immediate reports of casualties after it struck off the coast of Fukushima. However, there was some damage reported. That is the same region devastated by a deadly 9.0 quake and tsunami that also caused a nuclear disaster in 2011. A low-risk tsunami advisory was put in effect. Staying in the east, where South Korea's military says a North Korean missile fired from its capital region exploded in mid-air in an apparent failed launch. The launch on Wednesday was detected amid speculation that the North could soon launch its longest-range missile. This would be in its most significant provocation since 2017. It was the 10th such weapons test this year. Well, amid such ongoing threats of war and violence, the World Health Organization reports some good news in the fight against COVID-19. It says COVID deaths worldwide fell 17% in the last week, even as infections rose 8%. The latest report says that since January, infections rose in the Western Pacific and Africa, but cases dropped in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the Americas. Moving to China now, where the country's leaders are attempting to calm investors by promising to support the economy. Officials at a cabinet meeting said regulators should issue market-friendly policies to invigorate the economy. Chinese leaders are trying to revive economic growth that slid to 4% in the final quarter of 2021. This is compared with the full year's expansion of 8.1%. The slowdown was triggered by a collapse in construction and housing sales after Beijing launched a regulatory crackdown on debt in real estate. Meanwhile, Russia's economy continues to take blows following its invasion of Ukraine. Ratings agencies say Russia is on the verge of defaulting on government bonds, with billions of dollars owed to foreigners. The head of the International Monetary Fund conceded that a Russian default is no longer an improbable event. Russia says it might make payments in rubles instead of dollars due to sanctions on banks, and that by itself could be called a default. Well, on the other side of the world, in Haiti, the healthcare system is taking a hit amid a labor unrest this week. Thousands of doctors, nurses, and other health professionals across Haiti have gone on strike to protest a spike in gang-related kidnappings. A recent UN report said kidnappings in Haiti increased 180% in the past year. The United Nations is also advocating for Yemen and aimed at raising $4.27 billion on Wednesday. This to alleviate what it describes as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with 161,000 people likely to experience famine there in 2022. However, the UN's humanitarian chief said the fundraising drive was a disappointment, raising only $1.3 billion in aid on Wednesday. A Czech zoo has named a critically endangered eastern black rhinoceros calf Kyiv in honor of Ukraine's resistance to invading Russian forces. Poaching has reduced the number of the eastern black rhinos living in the wild to around 800. The Czech zoo has 14 after breeding 9 over the years that have been taken to Rwanda and Tanzania to live in the wild. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You could also watch all of our commentary, programming, and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us on Forum Daily News. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.